Obviously delighted to be supporting the podcast. And so Move Pre-Workout, we've got a strength-based formula, but this one is specifically designed for endurance athletes, and it's one of the first of its kind. We're just focusing on really high-quality ingredients that are going to benefit endurance performance of any kind. So, yeah, we're really excited by the product and delighted to be supporting podcasts like yourself.
Oh, it's amazing. And this is something that you are specifically taking before your training, before your rides, to be in best possible shape. I'd encourage you to give it a try. Go to movepreworkout.com and for a 20% discount, put the word endurance in at checkout. On with the show.
So yeah, Mark, I suppose I know most people will know a bit about your story, but for the rest of the audience and for us as well, can you just give us your first-hand account of, I suppose, how you've come to this place that you're at just now?
My background is all ultra-endurance expeditions, and I've spent over 20 years trying to break first and fastest. So what I'm proudest of with my teams is being part of a generation who have not just taken on, these huge journeys globally to well over 100 countries, but we've really managed to shift the dial. And there's another generation coming through now who are building on what we've done. So to give some specifics, I've cycled around planet Earth twice. That's a 18,000 mile record. Still hold that in 78 days. Still hold the world record for the length of Africa, Cairo to Cape Town. It's a 10,000 kilometer race. The Americas, so that's a 13,000 mile from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. Quite a lot of projects off the bike as well. So Arctic, ocean rowing, high altitude climbing. I'm off to Chile to climb the world's highest volcano tonight. I'll have to get there. I'll have to get there. I'll have to get there before we climb it. But my point being that the thing that I'm passionate about is that wanderlust of travel plus the physical and psychological challenge of how hard you can push yourself in those environments, which is very different from entering an Ironman or entering a race where you're trying to beat the people around you. My form of competition has always been in the expeditionary sort of journeyman field as opposed to traditional racing.
Mark, what I've always wondered when I hear about your feats, how did this come around? How do you think you're into this heavy endurance manic kind of expeditions or challenges? When did it start? Is it something that happened in your teens, or did it suddenly hit you?
The sport for me was never traditional sport. I was homeschooled. I grew up on a small farm in Perthshire, in the foothills of the Highlands. By the time I did go to school, in secondary school, it was still closer to go to Glenshee skiing than it was to go to school in Dundee, which was 30 miles away. So my lived experience, certainly in those formative years until I was 12, 13, was on the farm, working on the farm with my two sisters. So time in the outdoors, you got a strong work ethic because you're physical all the time. I didn't have to go to a scouts or to learn to be in the outdoors. It was just my life. In fact, an hour or two around the kitchen table, learning my times tables and to read and write. The rest of the time was working on the farm. There was, up to 15 horses and ponies to muck out and an exercise. There was 200 hens to collect the eggs from every morning. There was 60 goats to milk. There was a farm to run, dry stone diking, building stables. There was a farm. And I think that physicality was pretty important. If young people don't learn to be physical and also learn to manage risk and to make decisions for themselves, it's very hard to then transition into the expeditionary world where you're making decisions. It's not just about being physically strong, but it's about operating safely in that environment. And actually growing up in the farm is amazing for that. But it also probably tells you that I was not in an environment where I was being put into sports clubs. I was trying to sort of play football or rugby with others, or I was trying to sort of be picked for the team. There was none of that. It was purely about being out in the environment and moving. And moving for me was riding ponies. It was skiing. It was climbing. It was cycling. So moving through the environment was the wanderlust of what's off the farm and how far can I go. So when I was when I was 11 and said to my parents that I wanted to cycle Land's End John O'Groats because I'd read somebody who had done that in the Courier, the local newspaper, my mum quite rightly said, well, do you want to try something smaller first because you've not really cycled off the farm before? And so I cycled across Scotland. I think I just turned 12, from Dundee to Oban. And that was my first sort of multi-day trip, 145 miles. And the planning of that, as much as the actual ride, and then afterwards getting to hand over a charity check to Princess Royal, and the accolades that came from, and the recognition that came, you know, as a quite a shy, introverted, homeschooled kid, to do something which sort of cut through and got noticed. Not just was it fun for me to pull that off, but also it sort of became my thing. So of course, when I transitioned into high school, found the politics of the playground and suddenly having 1,300 kids rather than my two sisters around the kitchen table, that was pretty intimidating. So the wilderness and the adventure and the escape of expeditions was there from a very, very early age. If I could have done this professionally in skiing or horse riding, I would have done, but cycling was a more obvious way to pursue that passion. And, you know, I did my first 1,000-miler solo when I was 15. By the time I was leaving school, I was crisscrossing Europe, and it all looks slightly inevitable looking backwards. That's not how you live your life. The way you live your life is you sort of climb the next mountain, and then that reveals the bigger mountain behind it. And I'm now 43, and I look back at the stuff I did in my teenage years and say, well, of course that was going to lead to, but I don't think there's any of course about it. It was interesting. Myself and my two sisters, you know, we've ended up completely different animals in adult life, you know, different way of thinking, different athletic abilities and interests. So it's not simple enough just to say, well, because of your homeschooling and that you're going to end up doing this stuff. But I was 23 the first time I cycled around the world, and that was such an unlock, you know, to go for the ultimate. How fast can a human being get around the planet? That's when my life really changed.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, so the nature nurture thing, it's a real mix of both.
Yeah, it has to be.
But there's definitely some nurture in there growing up on the farm. I've heard that before.
Yeah, I think from
you're
my
working from an earlier age.
Yeah, like with so I've worked with supporting elite Scottish athletes in their nutrition over the past sort of decade, if not a bit longer. And one of the things I consistently see with athletes that really thrive, especially from up here, is being from that farming background. Now, I don't know.
It's funny,
well, there's probably a couple of reasons, one of which might be the sort of separate physical training that you just end up doing as part of your life. But I suppose one of the other ones is maybe just that fact that you don't necessarily have a choice with having to get up and really like pushing yourself day to day, and you've just got tasks that just need to be done. So you sort of just have to get on with it. And then I suppose you get lots of other additional benefits throughout life from having that kind of mindset as well. Well, I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly animal husbandry and farming is a huge responsibility for others, and it's a lifestyle insofar as it's everything that you do. You wake up. It's not like you go to work, you stop, and you know, farmers are farmers, and they're always switched on to the fact that they've got a farm to run. And I think it's the same with expeditions. If you were to treat this as a job in a normal sense, where you're saying, well, somebody else asked me to do this, and it's 5 o'clock, I need to stop now. That doesn't work when you're doing major expeditions. There's got to be an intrinsic motivation. There's got to be a real want to sort of take care of yourself, stay safe, push yourself, look after those around you, work in those high performance teams. And so I think that sort of all encompassing nature of major projects. I mean, the shortest record I've ever broken was the North Coast 500 record. And that's, you know, 520 miles or something. So, you know, nothing I do is about racing to fail. Everything I do is always about being sustainable over prolonged periods, normally weeks and months. You know, the expedition I'm about to go on later today is 2 weeks. That's a relatively short project for me. So it's a very different mindset than, you know, I'm going to be gym fit, I'm going to be incredibly strong, I'm going to, you know, smash my run training, and I'm going to prove how good I am over 2 or 3 hours. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm actually not a very good athlete in that sense, you know. And if you were to, because of my profile as a bike rider, people often come up to me in Edinburgh or whenever they meet me and go, "Oh, it's Mark. I'll race you," and I'm like, "You win, you win." Like that's not like if that's just not my environment. Like if you want to go 500 miles or 1,000 miles or 10,000 miles, yeah, we'll have a conversation. But it's you know, if you want to race me in 10K, you know, you win.
Yeah, and I suppose as well, like one of the questions I've got is because like you've been around the world twice now on a bike. So what sort of led you to wanting to do it the second time? Was it just the fact that you wanted to go faster? Because they were obviously quite different as well, with it being more sort of self-supported in the first instance. So yeah, why the second time?
The first time I cycled around the world, I was straight out of university. Ellen MacArthur sailed around the world finishing February 2005. And you didn't need to be a sailor to be inspired by what Ellen did. You know, it was like Alex Honnold and these athletes who just, their story is bigger than their sport. You know, it breaks through, and it's for me, it's the ultimate. How fast can a human being get around planet Earth? I was mid-university at the time, and I definitely took that and a few other things that happened in my life at that time. I was given the opportunity to go and do an internship in the US that built sort of a global mindset, took me out of my classroom environment at university, and I thought, right, you've got one chance. And if I could put all my cards on the table, what would that be? And if you've only got one chance, it's the world. So 2 years after Ellen, I cycled around the planet. I'd convinced the BBC to give me a camera, a contract worth nothing except the hope that if I made a success of it, they would put it on the telly. Half-hour BBC Scotland documentary was their hope, but nothing contracted. By the time I spent half a year unsupported, riding around the planet and breaking the previous record, not just did breaking the record sort of surprise everyone, but then the documentary got made into a 4-part series, went out on BBC One Network, and my life changed. As a 24-year-old, you know, I went from pulling pints in the bar in Glasgow to that level of sort of, you can imagine, the wonderful thing about doing something on network television like that is it's not sitting in the cycling papers. It's not preaching to the converted within the cycling world or the back page sports pages. It's, you know, 7 o'clock Saturday evening, kids, grannies, everyone's watching that. And the cut through with that story, the sheer scale of that challenge just created such opportunities in my young life. And at the time, if you'd spoken to me after I stood on the finishing line at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, I would have said, that's the hardest thing I've ever done. I've left it all out there, you know, smashed the world record by over 2 months, took it from 276 days down to 194 days. That's it. That's my ultimate. But of course, you carry on, you build teams around you. Looking back now, it looks like complete kindergarten the first time I cycled around the world. An amazing adventure. But it was more about what happened off the bike. Where am I going to sleep each night? Where's my next meal? Getting through Iran, all this amazing stuff. I look back now as an athlete and I thought, well, I knew nothing. In a good way. I mean, I had the naivety to throw myself into that situation. But of course, after doing a decade of other projects, building high performance teams, I had the quiet confidence to then go back and go, how could you do this fundamentally differently? And it's not a race for how fast you can pitch your tent. It's a race for how fast you can get around the planet. And that Victorian fiction, that sort of Phileas Fogg story, around the world in 80 days, could I actually be the first person in history under human power to get around the planet in less than 80 days? That is a one-time prize. I still hold the record. It will be broken. And I'd love to see it broken. But to be the first to go sub 80, that was huge.
Amazing.
And so, you know, yes, on paper, it's the same thing. It's the round the world record. But if you'd told me on the finishing line in Paris in 2007 that 10 years later I would stand in that exact same spot over 100 days faster, impossible.
Yeah. Almost two completely different journeys that you went on. And it might be difficult to draw comparisons, but is there one of those experiences that you look a bit more fondly on than the other?
Yeah, I mean, around the world in 78 days, 14 hours, 40 minutes is not the most fun bike ride I've ever been on. It was 1,100 hours of time trialing. I was out of my bed at 3:30 in the morning, on the bike at 4, riding 16 hours a day, less than 5 hours sleep, repeat for 2.5 months. It was absolutely brutal.
those flights between must have been the best thing in the world just for sleeping.
Yeah, most athletes complain about, long haul flights and scheduling. For me, it was the greatest periods of recovery. Flying business, getting a bed, and it was wonderful. But I mean, Paris to Beijing, that's leg one. That's 28 days racing. By the time I did leg 3 across North America, that's 5,500 miles from Anchorage to Halifax. I mean, these are huge chunks. The first time around the planet was a much better adventure in the true sense of the word. It was my daughter, my 12-year-old daughter, has been listening to my audiobook for The Man Who Cycled the World, which was the first time. And it's really interesting seeing her reflections on an adventure that happened 7-8 years before she was born. Learning about Daddy's cycle around the planet when, I wasn't married and I didn't have kids. And hearing her listen to it and her reflect on it, I realised not just as the world changed, you couldn't do the route that I had cycled back in 2007, but I've changed fundamentally. We're 20 years on. And as an athlete, and the wonderful thing about the first time you go on a big adventure is you don't know what you don't know. And there is something wonderful and to be cherished about the first time you take on your first marathon, your first century ride, your first multi-day, your first adventure, because you'll meet the world in such a raw, emotional, open way. And that's the best thing about sports, the best thing about travel. Because I've done this professionally now for 20 years, it's harder to surprise me. It's harder to shock me. It's harder. There's less things that I don't know. There's still a lot that I'm learning every month and every year. But I look back at my 23-year-old self pedaling around the planet and I think, wow, what an amazing time in anyone's life to put all your cards on the table and go, let's pedal around the planet.
Mm-hmm.
So Mark, did the attention come on you about halfway around the first time? Is that what happened? You kind of got halfway around and then the cameras were on you in some way?
The pressure was certainly off to begin with because there was a few people within the BBC who backed the ambition. The great late David Peat, who really shared that passion for filmmaking with me. And I think because I had very low expectations, I had no profile and I'd not really done anything on this scale before. There wasn't much interest at all. You're right. When it became clear that I was going to break the record by a significant margin, that changed, but not massively. It wasn't like the floodgates. The second time around the world, yes.
From the beginning.
The second time around the world, because we were being so audacious, the record at that point was held by Andrew Nicholson, a New Zealander, an Olympian, in 123 days. And I was claiming that I could go sub 80. So we broke the previous record by 37%. We broke our target by 1.44%. On the start line, people thought we were nuts. So the press and the coverage, if you look at what people were saying, I was very defiant on the start line and for the first 9,000 miles, proving that we could do it. And to your point, in the second half of the world, there was the turning of the tides and there was this sort of unblinking belief that we were going to do it. I don't think that quite existed in the same way first time around the planet because I just had no profile at that time. The big breakthrough really was not even on the finishing line when it was in the papers the next day and a bit of coverage. The real breakthrough was when it was 4 weekends in a row, Saturday night television, 7 o'clock. It's the Michael McIntyre slot and there's me pedaling around the planet. And that was months after I'd finished. And that's when my world changed. That's when things went to a different level. You go from pushing a rock up a hill, trying to get these projects funded and off the ground and trying to convince people that you're legit. And then suddenly you've got an avalanche of opportunities. You know, you're getting book deals and talk tours and the BBC are coming back and saying, where do you want to go next? Fully funded. That is quite a lot to keep up with because as a young athlete, there's so much of it, which is you trying to prove yourself and create the environment for you to be successful. And then when you do gain that platform and that profile, you've got to remember why you're doing it in the first place. You've got to try and stay true to what you want to do and not to simply, become a rudderless ship which is saying yes to anything that comes your way, because profile and sponsors and the whole success of what you do can end up defining what you do. And if you also then end up living in the box that you've built for yourself. So I was the around the world cycling guy, and I wanted to ocean row and mountaineer and do lots of other stuff. And it was actually really hard throughout my 20s and early 30s to reimagine myself, because I realized the more successful I was in one domain, the more people wanted me just to rinse, repeat. And I'm like, I'm not going to keep doing that. I'm going to take that passion and that profile, and I'm going to take it in a different direction. And it's so important for athletes, for young athletes, to remember that you have to be in charge of what you're doing. Everything else that's working around you is there to support your passion, but you're the one that has to, again, going back to that intrinsic motivation, be motivated to do it, and everyone else will follow that success. And there's allowed to be twists and turns in that road.
Yeah.
What was those last 4 or 5 days like? Was it tight and getting under the 80 days? You were about a day and a bit before, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Were you comfy?
The brutal thing about the around the world in 80 days is, if you mess up in any given second, the whole thing's over. Yeah. Everyone, the press, the public, even my team started to get quite complacent. Okay. You know, as we finished the North American leg and had the final 1,100 miles up through Europe, everyone's just thinking, well, this is a victory lap.
Procession.
Yeah. And I'm like, no. My average day, not my best day, my average day was 240 miles. So to smash out 240s back to back to back for 2.5 months, there's nothing in the history of endurance cycling. And I was scared right to the end. I had a big crash coming off the Pyrenees 3 days before the finish. That could have ended it. And even when we met the police escort by Versailles and then pedalled into the outskirts of Paris, even then I wasn't truly believing. You're so driven by the fear of failure. People often talk about positive motivation and inspiration. Well, I think accountability and negative motivation are pretty important for any high performance athletes. And let everyone else celebrate your success, but control the controllables. It's not over till it's over. And, you know, when I turned into the cobbles and rode up the Champs-Élysées and finally got to the finish, you can see, I would encourage people to go back and look. I'm rabbits in the headlights. I'm not really believing. Everyone else is pulling back flips for me and celebrating, but I've been racing. I've been racing for 2.5 months, and it's very hard to just go from on the ground, being the operator, to being at 30,000 feet and objectively going, hey, I did it. It's the world. It doesn't feel like the world. It just feels like you've been on this insane race, for sleep-deprived race for 2.5 months.
Yeah. So I think the sleep deprivation is something that not a lot of people necessarily think about. They think about maybe the distance, or let's say maybe the amount of miles that you've got to cover in one day, but that compounding effect on your body of day to day, absolutely smashing so many miles on the bike and then having a really limited sleep window. I mean, we look at the research, it's all saying, right, if you're doing any kind of intense exercise, you need to have at least 8 hours, probably pushing like 10 to maybe even sometimes 12. Yeah. That's clearly not even an option for you at that point.
I know, it's so funny. And obviously the algorithms on all our technology are set up for people who are not ultra endurance athletes. You know, you finish these sessions and it says take 60 hours recovery, and I'm like, well, I'm back on the bike in 4. Some of this is psychology. A huge amount of it is nutrition and hydration, and there's also, when you're doing ultra endurance, a real mindset around consistency. A lot of people who are racing are really racing to fail, even if it's a marathon. Mm-hmm. And they know they don't have to do anything the next day. The mindset with expeditions and ultra endurance, not just from a, can I complete this, but actually from a safety perspective, is how can I be as efficient as possible? How can I ride the road in front of me like it's a roller coaster, get active recovery, not be smashing myself on the hills, be as fluid as possible, be really thinking about my form on the bike or running or whatever it is. As we get tired in ultra endurance, we all have sort of physical tics in terms of how our body adapts to the sheer attrition of it. And there's two sides of training. There's the physical fitness, and then there's the conditioning. And a lot of people underestimate the conditioning side of it. They think, well, I'm fit in a strength sense. I've got a good FTP. I've got a good, split times and all that. But they underestimate the conditioning, the neural side of it, the ability for the body to suffer and adapt and cope and recover and get and go again. And I've written books on this, but it's still hard to understand it until you've experienced it, until you get out there and really build that. And when it comes to the psychological side of it, I guess the only superpower I've got, and I'm sure it wouldn't always hold, but if I was on the start line with lots of other people and they were smaller than me and stronger than me, and the belief I have within me is that I can outsuffer. And knowing that when it's 3 o'clock in the morning, you're in the graveyard shift, I've got the learned experience to be able to have a wry smile and know that this might be the toughest moment, but it's the most important moment to show up. And it'll also become your fondest memories. So that experience to know what it will become, and the ability to think your way through the tough bits, because consistency over time is what matters. It's not about being good when you feel good. It's about being able to show up regardless of the conditions. And clearly the inputs to that, your sleep, your hydration, are fundamentally important. But what overrides all of that is how you're thinking. And again, if the only person you're really trying to race is yourself, it does take away any sense of trying to show off or prove yourself to people. If you've ever ridden with me or run with me, you'll know that I'm always just very much within myself, and I'll let the results tell their own story. It's never about, because I know that you're going to burn the matches. I know you're going to suffer long term if you're doing anything in the moment that tries to show people how good you are. You've got to be intrinsically motivated, and you've got to be playing the long game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And with those, I suppose on the thinking side of things, because you're having such long days on the bike, you've obviously got so much data and input and things to think about logistically.
Yeah.
But in your mind, what are you thinking about for the most part for these long periods of time? It's maybe not the same kind of thing as, let's say, some ultra endurance swimmers where you don't have much to look at because you've probably got some nice views to look at. But what are you thinking about during some of those long days on the bike?
It's probably what sits beneath the question is the assumption that when you spend inordinate amount of time in your own head, that it gets lonely or boring. Most people live very, very busy lives where we're juggling many different things. The wonderful thing about ultra running, ultra swimming, ultra anything, cycling, is it's actually quite simple. It might be attritional, it might be hard, but it's quite simple. It's just about momentum, creating and keeping momentum, minimizing time off, optimizing distance covered. That is ultra endurance at the end of the day. And so everything you're thinking about is about creating and sustaining that momentum. A lot of people never spend time in their own head. If I said, go and spend 3 hours running in the Pentlands without taking, headphones to listen to music or to be distracted, a lot of people wouldn't even do that. They'd be like, well, I need some other stimulant. So I'd say there's sort of a natural societal assumption that if you spend a lot of time in your head, that will get lonely or that will get boring. Yes, you need to get quite comfortable in your own company. And yes, there are periods of, struggling to find the motivation to get through. You're not always out there sort of, driven and happy and all the rest of it. But what lies behind the question in terms of mindset, I think for a lot of people is just, it intimidates people. It's quite scary, this idea of spending days, weeks and months in your own head. And I'm not suggesting it's easy for a second, but I would encourage people to go on a multi-day trip and to really find their own headspace. I think it's such a
It's almost quite meditative.
an important thing to be able to do, to spend time in your own company. And the reality is you're thinking about pretty obvious, boring stuff. You are thinking about data. You are thinking about inputs. You are thinking about, how do I make this sustainable? And then the wonderful thing is when you go for long enough is you're digging out memories you thought you'd long forgotten. You're imagining the future, and you really, really get to think deeply about these things. You can think your thoughts in an unbroken way where you really can conclude your thoughts. I think it's amazing where the subconscious goes on ultra endurance when you're stimulating it through activity, when you're stimulating it through the environment around you. You know, the wonderful thing about cycling around the planet is you are earning the miles. You are literally, every day is different because you have pedaled yourself through that environment. You know, culture, people, place, landscape, weather, all the rest of it changes because you've created that momentum through place. That's constantly interesting. There's the constant intrigue around the next corner and over the horizon. And I would just encourage people to try and experience that. It definitely calibrates your thinking when you then come back to a more busy, distracted way of thinking.
Yeah, for sure. It's super interesting. Sorry, John. Go ahead.
No, just interested to know what you changed with your nutrition and your hydration. To go 100 days less, and obviously you had a different focus the second time, but that's remarkable drop. Is it? You said a lot of that was to do with nutrition, hydration, the planning aspect of it.
If you're doing anything that lasts for months, you have to keep your fueling as natural as possible. If you're doing something which is over within a couple of hours, then I'll give you an example. Say the North Coast 500 record. I'm in such an aggressive time trial position, I can't really eat any solid foods. I'm on 110 grams of carbohydrates an hour for 28 and a half hours. I've got to average normalized power 270 watts for 28 and a half hours. So you're just riding on a number. Whereas that's very different if you're going the length of Africa or around the world. There's a huge amount to be said on the hydration side, which is often missed, and maybe we can come back to that idea. On the food calorie side, the longer I go, the more natural I try to make it. The old adage, if your granny doesn't recognize it, don't eat it. Because I'm a big fan of gels and bars and things which are more modern fuels, factory made, if it's a short, sharp effort. And by that I mean up to Ironman distance. So this is unfair to anyone who's not talking expeditions, but if you're going multi-week, you really have to think about your microbiome, you have to think about your gut health, you have to think about your overall well-being. And there are certain things that we would do over a finite time period that you wouldn't do for 2 months. And I think that it's on that sliding scale how you think about hydration and inputs. And I've had some amazing people work with me over the last 20 years who've really informed my decision making in terms of making sure what I put in my body is as clean as possible. I'm not a purist about these things. You know, I still enjoy, you know, a glass of wine with my wife, and you know, I think it's really, really important to have moderation, even with moderation. So you don't have to be a purist about these things, but you do need to care. You do need to think about these things. And when you do it at my level, you do need to, you know, get your bloods checked and, you know, do some testing, do DEXA scan, do things which give you some baselines around who you are. So it's not just guesswork.
Yeah. What was your sort of biggest day in terms of energy expenditure? I mean, you probably would have got some on your wearable. The accuracy of that can often be debated, but yeah, what was your sort of big numbers over the course of that?
If we're talking about around the world in 80 days, again, because I was doing it every single day, my biggest day was the final day in Australia. That was 280 miles riding, and I would have been on about 10,000 calories that day. The fueling strategy is on the bike and off the bike. You're really not thinking about 3 square meals. You're talking about grazing. You also have to have a period, even if you're a ultra endurance athlete, where your gut recovers. You can't just, you know, smash food down for 24 hours a day. And so really thinking carefully about how you use stimulants, sugar, caffeine in particular, where they sit within a 24-hour cycle, and making sure that what you do on a day like that, as soon as you're off the bike, you're doing what's necessary to allow you to sleep, recover, get back on. So the simple things, at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, it's hard to eat anything. So it's sort of baby food, it's smoothies, it's making it as easy to get the calories down, cheating as much hydration in as possible at the same time, because everything slows down if you're not well hydrated. But then obviously when you're pushing incredibly hard and you get to high temperatures, humidity, then you can easily sort of flush out a lot of what you need. So getting the right sugar salt balances in, and so much about food and hydration is about preempting what, it's that old adage, stay on front of the wave, stay on the front of the wave. If you get behind on hydration, riding in the cold, you don't drink enough. There's so many tricks, knowing that if you can stay on the front of the wave in terms of your fueling and hydration, and that active recovery for what you're doing in 6 or 12 or 2 days time. Because if you get behind the wave, it's so hard to ever get back on. The times on expedition where I've got food poisoning or water poisoning, to carry on through that is harder than a bike crash. I've broken teeth, I've fractured bones, but actually food poisoning and gut failure on expeditions, I would argue, is harder than physically crashing your bike, because you don't have the fuel in the engine.
Yeah, the input's just completely gone, and there's nothing there to give. I think, especially with the round the world scenario as well, it's fascinating from my perspective, because we know that so many different environmental factors influence what your body needs, what happens when your body's trying to maintain that state of homeostasis, whether it's altitude, potentially a high reliance on carbohydrate at that point, or heat increasing electrolyte loss. Obviously, sweat rate's going to massively change. What was the environment that you felt most challenged in during that race around the world, from a nutritional perspective?
It's hard to extract the nutritional aspect from the climate. The hardest section was New Zealand into Alaska. So cleared New Zealand in the middle of winter in 5 days. There was a big storm coming through in the South Island. I was really struggling on the bike to get any fueling in, because the conditions were so icy and cold, and sub-zero, it's dark most of the time. Getting consistent fueling in through New Zealand and clearing the entire length of the country in 5 days was absolutely brutal, and not getting it quite right through there, the knock-on effect when I landed in Alaska, and psychologically sort of hitting reset after this massive battle across Australia and New Zealand, going, great, I've made it. And then you land in Anchorage after a long haul flight and you go, right, let's go 5,500 miles, and resetting on that next target. I had one of my biggest sort of psychological dips on the Alcan Highway coming down to the Yukon, just going, I'm not sure how to refocus and get the consistency on the next bit, because it just taken so much out of me getting through Australia and New Zealand on time and on track. And the thing is, with a race like that, trying to go sub 80, if you drop half a day, which would be so easy, it's almost impossible to make it back. You have to stay on top of that average. Because if you think about it, to suddenly knock out average 250s, 260s, 270s is so incredibly hard. Whereas to suddenly lose 50 or 60 days, 50 or 60 miles on any given day, well, that could be a border crossing, a flight delay. We had some pretty serious crashes and wrote off a sport vehicle at one point. I mean, things go wrong all the time. And if you suddenly lose a chunk of time, it's then going to take you 2 weeks to make it back.
Yeah, you can only do 5 miles a day more.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting what you said about the hydration. You need to stay on top of it and plan it really well.
Yeah.
And once you're dehydrated, you've got a real problem. Yeah. It's hard getting it back. So that pre-cycle, before the problem starts, you're fixing it. It's massive.
It's really important. A lot of people only think about fueling when they're on the ride or on the run. And people do not think enough about what they're doing 24 hours before. And sleep hygiene. I know that sounds a bit sort of medical, but really understanding what your routine is before you go to bed, because optimizing the recovery before your training or your event will have the biggest bearing on your physical ability during the event. And not just physical, but your decision making during the event. You very quickly go into idiot mode when you're doing ultra endurance. So your cognitive ability to deal with change, if something goes wrong, your tolerance to that, your overall sort of mood. There's very strict rules when I'm on an expedition about how my team around me work with me. The more tired I am, the more sleep deprived I am, the more the choices they make are. Would you like this or this? It's never, are you hungry? Would you like to eat? There's no open questions. I'm just a monkey on the bike, and I'm given very, very simple choices. The more sleep deprived I get. And knowing my own cognitive decline on ultra endurance and what space I go to be able to operate effectively in that place, you're constantly thinking that long game in terms of not can you do what you're doing when you're running or you're riding, but how do I then recover so I can make the next block sustainable? So where something like the pre-hydration, pre-workout really comes into its own is understanding the places in between, the gaps between your physical activity, as opposed to just thinking, wow, I'm sweating, so I need some electrolytes. This is much more about your cognitive function and your ability to perform sustainably once you actually show up, knowing that of course there'll be decline, the attritional effects of whatever you're doing, but giving yourself every opportunity through sleep and optimal recovery and through pre-workout to actually start in a place where you've got that ability to perform.
Yeah, massively. I think as well, like that whole prep and fueling during an event, people often think, yeah, it's about performance during that period of time that you're exercising, but actually with those multi-day events as well, your fueling during that period of exercise is incredibly important for your recovery afterwards and that compounding as well. So actually your fueling, although a lot of the research is based on performance in that one session, it's going to massively benefit you in terms of your overall energy balance and therefore how well you're going to recover and then be able to go into that next one. So yeah, it's I was watching and just the amount of different food and options that you had, like I think there was something around burritos maybe not being on the menu for a while. So yeah, some good options that you had.
Well, wraps are always handed out because it's something you can actually hold whilst you're on the bike.
Yeah.
So there's the practicalities of so anything you can put in a bottle, in a shake, or actually carry is the practicality of running or riding. There was always a joke, a sliding scale between 1 and 10 in terms of the complexity of actually getting it in your mouth whilst trying to do exercise at the same time.
Yeah, of course. It's so interesting with the practicality side of things because from my perspective, you can look at all the interesting data in the world on carb oxidation, fat oxidation, certain amounts of milligrams of caffeine, but ultimately it boils down to can you actually, let's say, open a packet or open a bottle and drink it? You can't do that if you're going uphill on a slidey slope.
No, we've got very, very simple rules when we're on the road. Never give fueling at the bottom of a hill. Never slow the momentum of a rider on hills. Really think about where you're fueling and how you're fueling. Have real check-ins in terms of our bottles being finished. There's no point in smashing something over an hour or two and then forgetting for the next 6. So we've got sort of a look up, look out rules with other riders. So if we're riding in groups, so much of what I do, I'm seen as a solo athlete, but I'm working in these high performance teams the whole time. So having the language and the rules of operation in terms of how you check in, and for the support team, you might just be thinking about the athletes here. But for my amazing support teams, whether they're logistics, performance, or media, they can't look after me if they can't look after themselves. So they've got to think of themselves as performance athletes. And even if it's my camera crew, they've got to be well fueled. They've got to be looking after each other. They've got to have the right headwear, sun cream, fueling, because they're also working in a sleep deprived, high performance environment. And again, that's often missed because everyone just focuses on the monkey on the bike. And then the team that's meant to be supporting them is slowly fading and they're not thinking about themselves, and then you get into big trouble.
Yeah, for sure. And we're sort of seeing that as well in a lot of different sports now, is that vision that actually the team behind the team is almost that next competitive advantage in terms of ultimate performance, because the better support that you can get as a standalone athlete, the better outcome you're eventually going to get as well.
Yeah. We organise every year this amazing charity ride for the My Name's Dory Foundation, and a lot of my coaching to the teams taking part is admin. It's almost military, but the admin that happens where you're not, people know how to ride the bike, but once you're off the bike, that golden 20 minutes when you've finished, starting your fueling, your rehydration, your prep, getting out your kit, let your skin breathe, really look after yourself. Because what you do in that first period, and how to, because we're often taking amateur riders who have never done anything expeditionary in their life on a 3-4 day high mileage project, a 700-800 miler. And it's really interesting, the stuff that you take for granted, having done it your whole life, where you take a group of amateurs who are stepping into that space. They know how to ride their bikes. It's all the other stuff. It really is thinking about how to stay on the front of the wave, basic admin around, get out your wet kit, sort yourself out, look after yourself, look after your sleep hygiene, because it's not how good you are on sort of day one. It's how good you are on day 3 and 4. And these things that you take for granted when you've done all these big expeditions, it needs explained. It needs broken down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, short-term thinking doesn't work.
Yeah.
You have to really think it through till the end. Yeah.
And so many people are used to going to the gym and just smashing out an hour.
That's all they have to worry about.
And that's it.
Mm-hmm. So you don't believe then? So off days, what's your feeling on that? We could talk about shouldn't do more than 4 or 5 days hard training. That you did 3 months.
Yeah,
16 hours.
I think that's different. No, when my normal training block, I'll have a day off each week.
Okay.
I've got a young family. I think it's fundamentally important that work, family, community, they're the 3 pillars of my life. And yeah, it's so important that I hit pause. But it's different when you're on expedition. And the amazing thing about ultra endurance is you can keep going. It's not like you get to the finishing line and you're just a sweaty mess and you're like, well, I left it all out there, I couldn't carry on. If you get to, when I cycled around the world in 78 days, 14 hours, I didn't lose any weight. What I was doing was brutal, was sleep deprived, but it was ultimately sustainable. Everything I was doing, I could have, if I had the willpower, I could have carried on doing. Physiologically, I was putting in what I was taking out, and that's the big difference. But no, of course, in normal training, you need to give yourself recovery time, and mentally as well.
Do you still have a lot of that data from that 2022?
Yeah.
Is it ever chat about it being published at all?
There's been a sort of a study of one, isn't it? We need lots more people to cycle around the world in 80 days, and then you've got an interesting
a case study would be interesting. I think just to not lose any weight over the course is just so. You see it with any sort of published case studies these days. There was a recent one looking at Kilian Jornet's 3rd place in Western States. Fascinating research. Yeah, it would have been really interesting to see that from yourself, someone that didn't lose weight and probably did a really good job of maintaining energy balance.
Yeah, there was all the obvious stuff around to actually verify the world record, speed, power, the rest of it, distances. But what's probably more interesting to you is the physiological side of it. Mm-hmm. When we did bloods, we did saliva samples every day.
Yep.
So you can see my cortisol level. Understanding what's happening. Because it's a pretty unusual place to be putting your body into. You're in a constant chronic state of overtraining. Most athletes, they would get to that place. Your ability to sprint or do any power, even your heart rate. My average heart rate going around the planet was like 105 because everything is tired. Everything's just like chronically overtrained. If you were to speak to a coach, you're like, you're doing too much, back off. But you're racing, but you're racing at a level which is sustainable over 2.5 months, which is a totally different ballgame. So yeah, there has been some write-ups done on that data, but it's it'll be really interesting. There's at least 3 other people going for that record in the next few years. It'll be really interesting to.
I was going to ask you that, yeah.
Yeah.
So people do try even now, or is it?
Yeah.
How do they beat 80 days? What do you think is possible?
Tailwinds.
I mean, the thing is, headwinds, tailwinds, good luck, bad luck, I think over such a duration, they all average out. You could be more efficient on the bike. You could feel better. I'm an 80 kilo. Sorry, when I was racing around the planet, I was about 87, 88 kilos. If you were 20 kilos lighter than me, then if you're resilient enough not to injure, I mean, the lighter you go, I've always thought being a big guy, being 6'3", and when I was doing the Worlds, as I say, I've always felt it was actually helpful to be quite resilient to injury, the fact that I wasn't a stick insect. But if you look at somebody like Lachlan Morton, who's wanting to break my record, you know, a tour rider in a more classic sort of tour shape, he's going to be more aerodynamic. His CDA is going to be lower, his power to weight ratio. And so on paper, there's no reason that if he's just a little bit faster for 1100 hours, he'll break the record. But there's so many other factors. And that's where it gets fascinating with ultra endurance. And ultimately, you've got to be able to suffer it. You've got to be able to spend
It's a mental. A huge part of that is your capacity for pain.
Yeah, you just got to be able, you've got to be able to live it. And I'll be the first to congratulate anyone that goes sub 78. It's something I'm incredibly proud of. There was 40 people working on that project over 2.5 years to be the first to go sub 80, and to break that, I would have the utmost respect.
Touching again on the practicality aspect, something like a multi-ingredient pre-workout, you know, I've found to be incredibly useful. Obviously, I'm a little bit biased having formulated the product, but like I've found it to be incredibly useful having something that does multiple different things for you, and you're also preparing ahead of time, like you said, and that being super important for your actual performance in a session. So, I mean, how have you used Move in your routine? Because ultimately, I just want to know if I can adjust what I'm doing to reflect what you're doing.
We were in touch over the last year, and it's been a bit of an education for me about pre-workout fueling and hydration. Whilst I'd given hydration at large a lot of thought in terms of being ready as I head into sessions, I'd never thought about it as a completely separate category. So you've really helped me to think about not just the ingredients and what you're taking before, as opposed to simply during, which is more to do with sweat and hydration, as opposed to some of the ingredients that you've introduced in. And also when you're fueling, so that idea of what you're doing sort of 2-3 hours before versus say 40 minutes before a session, whether that's a high intensity session, you're doing intervals or something, or you're heading out for a massive endurance ride. The other big thing for me that I've learned through Move pre-workout is a real interest in the quality of those ingredients. I've always, even though the world of ultra endurance is not drug tested the way Olympians or Commonwealth athletes would be, since the Round the World in 80 Days, a huge conversation for myself and other high performance athletes in the ultra endurance world is how can we operate to those standards? I think inevitably there should be testing. I think if anyone was going to benefit from cheating, it would be people in the ultra endurance world, because ultimately we're the people who are about optimizing recovery, and anything you do in that sports performance world, which is breaking the rules, is ultimately about recovery more than making you more powerful during the event. So something I've really appreciated through our conversations over the last year is your focus on how clean and how well tested the ingredients are, as well as the peace of mind that that gives me in terms of what I'm putting in my body and what I need to be doing in the period of time before training, which is quite distinct to what I'll then need to be taking during the training. So there's two distinct parts, which I've quite, but I didn't, when we were in touch a year ago, I already sort of cared deeply about A, what I was putting into my body, and B, making sure I was well fueled ahead of training. But there's also quite a lot that I've learned through the literature and the information that you've put out and shared with me, because it has allowed me to think about pre-workout as a category in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's certainly like the way we sort of saw it was it's a tool in the toolbox, and ultimately like it's allowing you to perform at a certain level, but also we want that certain level to be useful for everyone, whether it's someone that, let's say, just does go to the gym, maybe does a 5K, but also elite level performers that actually making sure what they're taking is safe is incredibly important. Making sure it's batch tested via informed sport is something that we had as a non-negotiable when designing the product, simply for that fact that we will have elite performers using it, and we want to make sure it's not only the best product in terms of the formula, but also the best product in terms of quality and that end product for the user.
Yeah. I mean, it all lines up to the very beginning of all this Move pre-workout was a simple mission of getting people moving. That's why we called it quite simply Move. And so there's two parts to the pre-workout, and in my mind, certainly, and in the team, the actual workout is massively beneficial for all the stuff that Tom will tell us about the formula. But we actually think of it as a tool to get to the gym or get on the bike or get on the track. So it's a precursor, it's a trigger. So for a lot of people, they'll come home from a difficult day at work, 10 hours, they've got kids at home, or they'll wake up extra early to be able to get their workout in. And sometimes the hard thing is actually getting on the bike or getting into the gym. So we've put a lot of attention on the compounds in there that help people feel that motivation to go, because the hardest thing is sometimes starting, and once you're there, you're
I like that, because people are very good at compartmentalizing their lives. This is my family time, this is my work time, this is my training time. What's really important with Move is, and everything we've been talking about, is this idea of it's everything that you do allows you to move more effectively, whether you actually want to be an endurance athlete or a power athlete, or just want to look after your well-being and longevity in terms of your quality of life, not necessarily just, how long you live for, but just making the most of your physical ability to show up and to move. And the good thing for me in terms of Move pre-workout is it encourages people to think about the spaces in between the sessions, as opposed to just what they're doing whilst they're being active. I've really been thinking quite a lot over the last couple of years around when you live your life in big projects, it can always feel like you're on a race to get to the end of something. And once you've done this enough, you realize that getting to the end of those races and getting the world records or the documentaries is not always the reason you were doing it to begin with. It might feel that way the first time you run a marathon or the first time. But this idea of life is a dance, not a race. So what you do every day and how you interact, how I interact with you, how I interact with this situation, what I'm doing and what makes me feel alive. If you think of life as a dance rather than a race, then you're not constantly trying to get through stuff. You're not constantly trying to get to the end, and you're speaking to somebody who's spent their life doing big linear journeys. I've found that quite a useful way to think about things, because it does stop you compartmentalizing things and saying, well, I got through that, tick, I got through that, tick. That's not a particularly useful way, even though we need to be motivated by having big targets. If you just see everything in life as an interaction, as a dance, then how to be better at doing that dance becomes more interesting. And that's where what you put into your body matters, your sleep matters. It's just perhaps a slightly different way of thinking about motivation.
Yeah, Absolutely. And nobody is motivated every day.
No.
And the internet will tell you that that's what it's like. Gym nuts are motivated every day. Nobody's motivated every day. So sometimes it doesn't take much to get motivated. Sometimes it's watching a Rocky fight or Rocky training, and then suddenly I can do an hour of training. So that's a mental issue. That's not your body not feeling like training today. So we feel like this is a really useful tool of many tools that can get you into the gym more. And that's the overall mission.
And it's like anything in life. We're creatures of habit. So the more that you build these things into your routine, the more taking a pre-workout becomes a trigger for the fact that you're getting ready to move.
Exactly. Yeah. Part of your routine.
I've been using Move pre-workout, mainly the endurance formula. You won't be too surprised to find out consistently throughout my training. I've been, certainly over the last 3-4 months, been juggling a schedule of running and riding, which I'm normally more on the bike, but because I've been training for a mountaineering and high altitude marathon, there's been a lot of double sessions. Yesterday was wake up, take a Move pre-workout because I had to do a turbo session. On the bike inside, you're sweating a lot more, so really looking after my electrolytes during and straight after that session, and then taking a Move pre-workout later in the day, knowing that I was going to be doing a run session later in the day. So that's a double session for me. So some days aren't so intense, but it very much depends when I'm training. But I've most consistently been using Move pre-workout in that hour and a half to sort of 45 minutes before I go into a session. It can change depending on what else I'm doing on the day. I think it's good to have sort of rough rules for these things, and I'm sure with the formulation, Tom, you've got very sort of prescribed way of thinking about these things, but it has to adapt to whatever else I'm doing in a given day. But it's been a really good thing to sort of build into my routine over the last year.
And how do you feel that it supports your training?
It's always hard when you're focused on training to extrapolate out a single change that you would make. So I work with my coach, I work with other sports scientists, nutritionists. I try not to change too much at any one time. I feel great at this point in time. I've been training hard. I've got a big focus in Chile over the next couple of weeks. Everything's going well, and that's juggling a busy work and family schedule as well. So I'd be scared to take anything out of that formula. It's very hard for me to turn around and say, well, it's any one of those things. I think I'm very careful about what I add into my routine because I don't want to overcomplicate things. Over the winter, I'll take, a minimal amount of additional supplements just to make sure my vitamin D and magnesium and whatnot is I'm getting optimal recovery. But I do try and live a pretty clean life. I am an omnivore, but most of my week I'm on a pretty veggie pesky diet, and occasionally we'll have good quality protein meat, but that's certainly not on an everyday. When it comes to Move pre-workout, I have massively benefited from adding that into my routine. It's very hard in a sort of a scientific way to say how much did that shift the dial within my numbers that I'm showing as an athlete. It's odd to say that I've not seen any downsides, but the low bar from adding anything into your routine, and this could be anything, is it's certainly not detrimental. This could not just be about your performance, but taste profile. Do you actually enjoy drinking it? And it's something I enjoy drinking. I enjoy the flavors. I see the benefits when I'm training, and it's now part of my routine. Giving a scientific response in terms of did it improve something by 1% or 10%, that's always much, much harder to say because it's as a part of a combination of everything else that you do.
One of the major things we saw before we produced this product was there was downsides to some of the similar style products out there.
That's interesting, and it's hard to quote unquote promote a brand by saying, well, it's not negative, but it's really important that it does.
Sure.
Yeah. First rule of sports nutrition: do no harm.
Yeah. And I think what was out there was doing harm, and that's anecdotal evidence for myself, for training partners, lots of people. So one of our major goals in this was to make sure that there wasn't a downside to it.
And a big issue with ultra endurance is taste fatigue. And I know that sounds a bit sort of petty, but if you're doing something constantly for months and years, you've got to enjoy it. You know, I think people forget with food and drink that fundamentally we're meant to enjoy what we eat. You know, our taste buds matter. It's not just about fueling. We've got to actually enjoy what we're putting in our bodies.
That takes a lot of effort to produce the products that taste good, because naturally some of these compounds don't, you know, so it takes a lot of time. We've probably spent more time than we ever thought sampling, resampling, retrying to get to a place where they're tasty. Because a lot of time, if people try something that doesn't taste good, they'll move on to something else immediately.
It could be the best thing in the world, but if it doesn't taste good, you know, athletes aren't necessarily going to use it.
In terms of the season ahead of me, I'm heading to Chile to join a team to try and do a Guinness World Record attempt for the world's highest marathon. Climbing a mountain I've climbed before, Ocos del Salado, world's highest volcano, to 6,900 meters, and then trying to run off the summit. But I mean, running at 6'9" will be a huge challenge, and nobody's ever tried that before. The current record's set at Base Camp Everest, which is a good bit lower. And the whole point of that expedition is led by Becoming X, and it's about taking amateurs to these extraordinary places. And I'll be there with Aldo Kane and some of the other professionals to try and take people who have never been to high altitude, who have never run a marathon like this before, to do something truly difficult. So that's a real duty of care and responsibility. It's not just about, can I break it, but can we take other people to these extraordinary places? Everything I do with the Endurance podcast series is about giving people not just the inspiration, but also the information to be able to go out and push their ambitions. And if you were to say to me, do you want to go out and smash another solo record? I'd probably say no, I don't have that motivation at this point. I get much more joy trying to help other people. So looking forward to this year, we've got the Big Dotty ride that we organise every year. That's 700 miles. That's as soon as I get back from Chile, really. It's a huge fundraiser. Really proud of the community that Rob Wainwright and myself and others have built there. And then thinking forward to the summer, going to try and set the world record for the mixed team going the length of Europe, 6,000 kilometres from Nordkap in the Arctic to Tarifa down in the Med, so the length of Europe top to toe. But again, that's a mixed team. A couple of well-tested, proven athletes like Jenny Graham and myself, with a few who have never done anything like this before. And again, I find that a lot more motivating at this point. Can we take people to these truly difficult places and help them break their first records? We'll probably do a 4-day Land's End John O'Groats as a training ride for that. So we'll probably fit that in May time. So it's quite a busy 6 months ahead.
Wow. Yeah, amazing.